We are on our first briefing of the General Fund 2021-22 amended budget. Dr. Swift.
Thank you, President Lazarus and trustees and members of the community who are joining us. Ms. Minnick is going to go through two components that we do every June. So trustees, you are very familiar with this. The numbers change, but you're familiar with the format. The first one is amending last year's budget. This budget that we're about to wrap up here at the 30th of June. The second part is it is her role this evening to set out the budget for the 22-23 fiscal year. Now, trustees, you're experienced at this, but folks in the audience might ask, but I don't think you have a state budget yet. How is it that you are here examining our budget for 22-23? And you know that is because that you are required by law to pass a balanced budget by June 30th, whether or not we have those answers from the state. So again, this year, we are in the position of bringing forward a budget. I've been able to speak with each of you about this, and I just want to point out, we do see wild fluctuations of numbers, and the number 6 million, Ms. Minnick, it's just an astounding number. But when we think about it in perspective to our overall operating budget, it is 2%. So 2 pennies on a dollar. So we do have to, as we look at this, keep things in perspective, although every penny on every dollar matters to this fiscally responsible board and to the superintendent and our community. I want to point out, and trustees, we've talked about it month by month, this past 2 years has been literally felt like a roller coaster ride. And it wasn't just COVID surges, it was trying to meet the needs of students, to attend to in-person learning. And trustees, we had, and I know the movie is ancient and our children have probably never heard of it, but the movie City Slickers, and throughout the movie, the talk is the one thing. And I wanted to share that this evening in thinking about both of these budgets. The one thing for us this year was a priority for healthy and safe in-school learning. Trustees, you know, we heard it from our community. We know it in our very own heartbeat, our very own DNA. We wanted our students in school on every day they possibly could be. So the lion's share of this budget is ensuring our staff recruitment, retention, and this past year, and I appreciate all of your support, trustees, we had to amend compensation through the year in order to fulfill our priority of in-person learning. We also had to amend the way we supported students. We added staff for more support because we wanted to make sure that our student needs were met. We weathered all of these COVID-related costs, and whatever it takes was our mantra to ensure that our families and our students would have that opportunity for in-school learning. The roller coaster of our experience, and if I say the words Delta or Omicron or BA123 add-on, those were experiences that we had, but they also show in our budget numbers. So month by month, you notice the numbers swinging wildly. So while we are normally tuned to compare this year to last year and to think about this year in comparison to next year, because of this roller coaster of COVID impact and expense, comparison across years is not very useful. So, my job is to tell the narrative and to set the stage. Miss Minnick does the work. And I just want to publicly thank you, Miss Minnick, and your team, because the $23 million that we received in federal infusion was a tremendous support to keep our schools open. We would not have been able to do it otherwise. But I do know that every penny of that made extra work for you all and a lot of stress trying to sort it all out. Trustees, I'll share one example, and then I know we need to move forward. Just one example from thousands of line items. In the before times, covering substitutes so that we can provide our teachers and all of our staff their legally and morally deserved days off for illness and bereavement and other leaves. In the before times, that line item was $3.5 million. And it was pretty consistent year over year. We might have a flu wave, but still it always stayed pretty stable. We don't know all of it yet because we have 2 more bills to receive. And yes, I do ask about the sub-bills, and I've never done that as superintendent before, but I watch every one of them these past 2 years. This year, we are projected to be north of $8.5 million just in that one line item. So you see a difference of $5 million just in one area, and yet that was a necessary cost in order to achieve our mission of schools open on every day that we possibly could. It was impossible to predict. In the fall, we thought it would be Delta and then we would settle down. In the winter, we thought, okay, we'll get through Omicron, it'll settle down, our expenses will settle down. These last 3 substitute bills are the biggest ones we've had at any time during the year. So I just want to share with the trustees, that's just one example. We could talk about many others. It never settled down in terms of the expenses. So I just want to thank our staff, our students, our parents, and our community. We were able to leverage every dollar in support of children being in school. And we invested those dollars in healthy and safe in-school learning. And so Ms. Minnick is going to walk you through both the amendment, which is the rectification of the budget that we're finishing, and then she will also set out the 22-23 budget. Trustees, as you know, this is a spending plan. And so then it is our work, once the plan is in place, to adjust as we go. So trustees, the obvious question is, how do we stabilize after a year of federal dollar infusion? How do we stabilize? And I want you to know, trustees, we continue to work on that every day, almost every night, in those conversations, because so much of what we have done, folks want to keep because it turned out to be helpful for children and for staff. So we are in the business of sorting that out now. And this is our spending plan for next year. And I thank you, Ms. Minnick, for overseeing the process, and we'll give it to you now to do your work. Thank you, trustees.
Thank you, Dr. Swift. And thank you, trustees and community. Thank you for this opportunity. It's my pleasure to present to you the proposed general fund final budget amendment. The first slide really is not meant to be legible. Of course, it just doesn't fit on one page. But the idea is to give you an overview of that budget document and what we will be reviewing in compartments, in categories this evening. So we'll take a look at this by category. We'll start with revenues, and then we'll break down expenditures by topic, those instructional expenditures, and of course the non-instructional expenditures. And then we'll take a look at how the net adjustments to those revenues and expenditures impact our bottom line, impact the fund balance. So the next slide here, we will just focus very broadly on the revenue category. And just to orient you to this document, we see the 4 sources of revenue: local, state, federal, and interdistrict resources. And those are terms promulgated by the state of Michigan, the Michigan Public School Accounting Manual, and sometimes they are straightforward and sometimes not. In this case, interdistrict sources refers to that county-wide special education enhancement millage. So just to be clear, that's what those figures represent. And so as we move across then to the right, in the first column, we see our current adopted budget. Then we see our proposed amended budget. And then a column just to illustrate what that variance is, what that adjustment is to each of those line items. And just very quickly before we move on, you'll see in that variance column there at the top for local sources, a very large decrease. And so I wanted to just take a moment to refresh our memory on that. Recall that the school aid bill was passed last July, 1 year ago, but of course it occurred after our statutory deadline to adopt a budget, which is June 30. And it was passed in July, and the language of that bill provided funding for certain districts in an amount in excess of the state share that was outlined in the legislation as a foundation allowance. So for those districts, that includes Ann Arbor Public Schools, we had to reduce our hold harmless levy in order to accept the full value of the state share of the foundation allowance. Recall that our foundation allowance is comprised of local dollars and state dollars. So we levy our operating mills, and then the state contributes to make us whole from the school aid fund. So there's that component of the local dollar and the state dollar. So we look at it as a bundle, but we did just that. We amended our tax levy, and we decreased our hold harmless mills, and that generates then a decline in those revenues in the local sources. And we see then an increase in the state level sources, because together that comprises our school aid, quote unquote. Now, of course, there are other local sources of revenue and other state sources of revenue, but those are our primary operating funds, school aid. So as we move then to take a deeper dive into these revenue numbers, as I mentioned, that local and state source, we can think of that as a combined source of revenue for the district when we talk about school aid. So looking at those totals in blue, then you can see that the net variance for local and state funding combined is about $4.6 million, a net increase. So some of the factors, the variables that gave rise to this change is, first of all, the foundation allowance. At this time last year, news out of the state, both from the executive, the Senate, and the House budget proposals, the consensus revenue estimating conference, all of the factors at that time led us to an assumption that the projected increase in our per pupil funding would increase by $50 per pupil. After the board adopted that budget, we came to realize over the summer that the actual increase per pupil was $171 per pupil. So that net adjustment is about $2 million. We were also fortunate enough to apply for and receive Section 31O funding. And that is a section of the school aid bill that provides for assistance for hiring social workers, nurses, counselors, that type of student support. And so this year, we are receiving in June, as a matter of fact, $1.86 million. And then, of course, other assumptions at that time around special education funding, at risk, retirement, a number of other categorical funding amounts, as proposed in that executive budget, came to about $700,000. So I'm just covering those significant highlights that make up a majority of those variances. So that's the local and state monies. And then on the next slide, we'll take a look at the federal revenue sources. And to highlight, as Dr. Swift mentioned, the main theme here is our ESSER dollar allocations. Here we see a subtotal of $24.8 million infused into our school district in order to respond to COVID and support that in-person learning and mitigate COVID. So while we see that increase of $24.8 million, we see above that the variance is only $22.9 million. So that tells us that there were some decreases to be made to arrive at that net increase of $22.9 million. And that's not unusual. Every year we have variances in our other federal grants, Title I, IDEA. Oftentimes we may have some carryover of monies, and that has a lot of variability to it. So those changes are not unusual. So then as we move to the other side of the ledger and we take a look at our expenditures on the next slide, again, not easy to read, but we will, just for illustrative purposes, we'll be taking a look at the instructional support and instructional support services, and then we'll also take a look at those non-instructional costs. So as we break it down on the next slide, we take a look at those instructional services and instructional supports. And if we subtotal those grand total lines there, you can see that we have a net amendment of $18.8 million. An increase then to our classrooms, to our instructional supports for our students, and that is 85% of our total budget. So we are absolutely dedicating our dollars into the classroom for students and direct student supports. So some of the highlights here I've noted is that in response to COVID, we deployed many of our ESSER dollars toward retention pay enhancements and increased incentives for our employees, as well as our hourly employees, to attract and retain that high-quality staff. We saw building substitute increases so that we could have high-quality substitutes to maintain that continuity of learning in person in our schools. So that is the bulk of the adjustment of those ESSER dollars and a very large adjustment to our expenditure budget for instructional services. On the next slide then is the non-instructional support services. And then this results, of course, then in the remaining 15% of our total budget. But I'll just highlight some of the most significant variances here. First, on the general administration line, the most important factor driving this variance here is the required increased volume of required legal work. On the operations and maintenance side, again, across through all of these, we have the 2% employee retention, contractor incentives, and I want to note the ventilation and utilities. As we mitigated COVID, we had the enhanced ventilation in our classrooms. Of course, all of that fresh air during the colder months required heating, and so we saw increases in our utility costs, and then, of course, our one-time mold remediation at our Pioneer Theaters gave rise, of course, to that budget adjustment. Transportation, we made adjustments for reorganizing those routes from a 3-tier system to a 2-tier system. Previously, we had 3 tiers, meaning we had routes that serviced the high school students, and then a 2nd tier for the middle school students, and then a 3rd tier for our elementary. And we reorganized those to where we have our secondary students in 1 tier and then elementary in another. On that central line, the primary driver here is technology, staff, hourly incentives, increases overtime, repairs, and software costs that are necessary for those student supports in learning. And then there's a category not listed here because it's not much of a materiality difference, but we do have something called other financing uses, and that accounts for transfers that we make across funds and some indirect costs for grant expenditures. So I just wanted to point that out. And so on the next slide then, we want to take a look at how these revenues that we reviewed and the expenditures and how those impact our final budget then. So again, just to orient you to this document, we see our total revenue then as we read across that the current adopted budget for revenue calls for $262.6 million. The proposed amended budget then, we are proposing an amendment to $293.2 million for a positive variance of $30.6 million. On the expenditure side, our current adopted budget calls for expenditures of $269.2 million. We are proposing an amendment of $294 million, and that also is a positive variance of $24.7 million. The next line is the amount of the revenue over or under the expenditures, and this is the amount where we would either add or deplete fund balance. So the current budget calls for a dip into that fund balance of $6.7 million. We are proposing an amended budget of a use of that fund balance of $771,000 for a positive adjustment of $5.9 million. And as Dr. Swift mentioned, this is that value, this variance, that is about 1.92% of our overall proposed amended expenditures. As we read down then, we see some lines about the fund balance, and it is abbreviated. So it means fund balance, beginning of year audited, and fund balance, beginning of year projected. So when we adopted this budget last year, we didn't quite know what our true fund balance would be because it hadn't been audited yet. So our fund balance there was projected to be $20.1 million, and we planned to dip into that by 6.7. So our end of year projected budgeted fund balance was $13.4 million. Looking at the proposed amended budget column then, given that we anticipate a use of our fund balance in the amount of $771,000, we know now that that audited beginning fund balance is $22.2 million. So when we add those together, we come to an end of year projected fund balance of $21.4 million. And that is equivalent to about 7.3% of the total revenue value and 7.3% of the total expenditure value. Now, when we convert that $21 million of fund balance, to Trustee Kelly's point, when we convert that to the number of operating days, that comes to 19 operating days. And although the board policy calls for a fund balance range of 6 to 15%, we certainly fall within that range. But from a financial management perspective, we do like to see that increased fund balance percentage, and we see that in contrast to the original budget, the original adopted budget. So I'm happy to take any questions you may have. I will just emphasize Dr. Swift's points that that common thread through this school year absolutely was our supports for students to maintain that in-person learning, the strict utility of every dollar of those ESSER funds, and of course, any of our sources. And also just emphasize her points around the complexities of those projections and those assumptions. And we'll see that in next year's budget as well. But where we would normally look at comparing year-to-year revenues or year-to-year expenditures, this really is the third year of just unusual revenues and expenses, starting with fiscal 20. So fiscal year 20, 21, 22, which just adds really some variety in our day, but it just doesn't bode well for keeping consistent types of forecasting and assumptions. So it's just a little different this year, and it will be different next year as well. But I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Minnick. I appreciate that you had some variety in your day this year.